So hello everyone, and welcome to the Capgemini webinar, Supply Chain Resilience in a Post-COVID World. And this is Jörg Junghans speaking. I'm a Vice President within Capgemini, and I'm heading parts of our digital supply chain practice within business services. And with me, I have my colleague, Carolina.
Hello, everyone. So maybe I can briefly introduce myself as well. My name is Carolina Gonzalez. I am a Transformation Senior Manager within Capgemini's digital supply chain practice within business services as well. And yeah, happy to be here.
Very good. So it's the two of us who are going to run the next 20-25 minutes with you on the topic. And maybe an additional interesting data point is both Carolina and I, we belong to Capgemini's business services unit. That means our businesses, we transform and run our clients' supply chains in order to further integrate them and deliver superior business outcomes. So that's just to better understand how our thinking is. So in the next couple of minutes, we would want to walk you through to warm up and some of the challenges in the COVID world that we identify and we observe out there with our clients and in the markets, which leads us immediately to a conversation on why supply chain resilience has ever been, but even more so nowadays is very important. And we'll also look into some of maybe those points which keep supply decision makers up at night and talk about some of their focus areas or what we believe supply chain operators' focus areas may be. And then we jointly conclude on the topic. So Carolina, why don't you take it on and warm us up with some of your insights?
Very good. So I think that by now pretty much everyone is aware of the impact that coronavirus has had on supply chains. So I will not formulate a lot on that, around that. But in summary, I think everyone is aware that coronavirus has been a proof that organizations need to rethink the way their supply chains are structured and organized. In order to make this a little bit more tangible, and as I said, I won't spend much time on that, but let us briefly recap some of the most relevant challenges that supply chain organizations have been facing during the last weeks and the last months. So one of the challenges that many of our clients and many companies are facing is that there are factory shutdowns everywhere. And this, of course, leads to the need to look for alternative suppliers, alternative sources of goods. And this, at the same time, translates into longer delivery times and delays expected across many industries. At the same time, there is a shift in demand. There is for instance, unexpected peaks in demands, not only for essential goods, but also for some other kind of unexpected goods. So one example of this could be home fitness equipment, right? So there are peaks in demands that companies were not planning for, and it is making it challenging for many manufacturers, producers, and in general companies across all industries to plan for demand. On top of this, there are many other situations like the ones related to quarantine restrictions and travel restrictions. So the impact that this has in supply chain is, for instance, in terms of labor shortage. So we know that this is impacting supply chains at all operational levels. So it could be, for instance, a lack of staff at warehouses. But now we have also more regulations, and many companies are facing bottlenecks. So, for instance, when it comes to customs or to ports operations, so this is something that that has had a huge, also monetary impact for many of our clients and for many companies out there. On top of this, and I think this is a trend that may be there to stay, due to quarantine and stay-at-home regulations, the consumer patterns have changed. So this means there is, for instance, a shift in sales channels. So many consumers, instead of going to a physical store, now are ordering more online, and this is going to have an impact on the delivery chains and also in supply chains and logistics operations. So these are just some challenges, and as I said, going beyond the obvious challenges that coronavirus is bringing, in my opinion, as I mentioned, this crisis is just a proof that organizations need to rethink the way their supply chains work. This is some of the learnings that now many companies are having, is that there is an urgent need to adapt business strategies and identify and fix gaps along the supply chain. And many of these problems have been there for a while. So many of these challenges were existing or were already there even before this crisis made them more evident. So here the question is, what are these challenges and that were already there before this crisis emerged? So if we take a look at how supply chain ecosystems work, all of us who have been in the industry, we know that the ecosystems tend to be quite complex. So we have many parties involved. It is not about just a shipper sending something from A to B. There are many parties involved in the supply chain ecosystem. So it can be carriers, freight forwarders, customs operations, and any third-party suppliers. So we are speaking not about complex transactions in terms of movement of physical goods. We are also speaking about complex transactions and a huge exchange of information and data flows. So if we take a look at how does it work today, we have many manual and low-value activities that are taking place along the supply chain. In addition to this, we have siloed operations, a lack of visibility along the entire supply chain. In some cases, there is a lack of transparency when it comes to dealing with customer inquiries, and also in terms of ownership, process ownership, and this clear split of work and transparency to avoid effort duplication. So what we have seen also when it comes to logistics and supply chain is that many companies are postponing the adoption of technologies in order to avoid the risk that may come with a new technology setup or the monetary cost that this might imply. And yeah, this brings me back to my point that this crisis has just magnified the need for supply chains. And Jörg, I think it would be good if you could maybe formulate a little bit more around supply chain resilience and why is it so important?
Right. I mean, I believe it's undisputable that supply chain resilience has always been a key thing to achieve, and it may tend to have been forgotten. But now, as you say, Carolina, it's a lot of problems which have been under the surface now get catalyzed by the COVID situation and prove whether or not a supply chain is resilient or maybe lack resilience. And for why it is so important, it's extremely simple to illustrate. If you look at this illustration right here, so it means that a more resilient supply chain is less subject to potential disruption coming along from all kinds of influences. Secondly, a more resilient supply chain allows to get back to normal quicker, which specifically in the times we're currently in is an incredibly important characteristic of a supply chain, not only accommodating the problem and the challenges which are around, but also allowing to get back to business as soon as possible. And of course, a more resilient supply chain may be able to even anticipate a next potential downturn, a next potential crisis coming up, whatever that its nature may actually be. So with organizations having to process more and more information, that's also something that drives supply chain complexity. And this and other complexities need to be addressed in order to keep a competitive edge, in order to keep up customer satisfaction and reputation, and in order to keep up a running and high-performance supply chain for a corporation. So if we were to carve out a handful of quick fixes on where to look at in order to start acting to further foster supply chain resilience, then it may actually be looking into a corporation's or supply chain's monitoring capability, right? So it is key to have developed or enhanced supply chain monitoring capabilities to improve visibility and transparency. One key element of that may actually be supply chain data, its quality and the way it is leveraged and used along the supply chain or across the supply value ecosystem. And on top comes, I believe, what many supply chain managers are currently already doing anyhow or have done already, is reviewing the supplier landscape and start optimizing that. And another key point for consideration may sound easier than it actually is, having some buffers or contingencies to actually allow for ad hoc or increased agility. And easier said than done. I'm aware of that, simply because the past decade was driven by the paradigm and mantra of supply chain efficiency, which doesn't leave a lot of room for having buffers or contingencies. Yet, I guess one of the learnings is if everything is maxed out to the edge, it's difficult to actually prove agility in your supply chain. So again, closing the thought here is supply chain resilience has always been and is more important than it's ever been. Now, if we were to look at areas which we could start to address, or if we were to pick areas, 5 areas which we want to start addressing, then Carolina and I want to talk about like the 5 that you see here. That's in procurement, it's planning, it's around fulfillment and order management, delivery, as well as supply chain data. And I propose we share our views on some of these, which give us an indication on where we believe that supply chain practitioners and the ones who are responsible for supply chains should start looking at or should intensify their endeavors, because we truly believe those are super important. So on procurement operations, we had it already once or twice in the past couple of minutes. The fact that supply discontinued and was disrupted obviously puts up a focus on procurement operations. So the recent outburst has not only hugely impact the sourcing chain, but it also shed light into the lack of an overview on local or even regional suppliers. What I mean is, if there is not enough visibility on what's my immediate next layer, the tier 1 layer of my suppliers, but also the layers 2 or tier 3 and tier 2 and tier 3 layers. I mean, I'm just not in a position as a supply chain manager to basically ensure resilience and supply chain continuity. That means driving up the visibility into the supplier landscape through analytics or a procurement digital procurement platform, combined maybe with a stronger, more operational view on supplier contract management to better assess and understand underlying risks and obligations of the supplier relationship, are key things to consider for now. When it comes to enabling tools, I believe why not looking into more innovative opportunities like a blockchain solution, right? So the blockchain is or puts a supply chain in a position to have more focus and to get support in orchestrating the supplier landscape, onboarding, managing, checking certifications, managing the interaction on the next tier 1 layer, but also on the layers beyond. So when it comes to procurement operations, I believe supply flexibility and local vendor relationships are some of the key cornerstones when it comes to procurement resilience. Proper procurement and supplier management obviously depends to some extent on a proper supply plan, which is linked as an input factor also to a proper demand plan. And that brings us to the next point, forecast and demand planning. So as demand volatility has gone crazy in COVID times, we need to acknowledge that there have always been specific industry sectors who have always been more subject to demand volatility than other sectors. And these guys have had invested earlier than others into tackling the challenge to drive up demand accuracy. And when it comes to a better short-term understanding of where demand comes from, only this puts a corporation in a position to basically properly balance out and avoid unnecessary cost, avoid obsolete cost, avoid having the wrong stock available, and to basically avoid unnecessary cost position on wrong and obsolete cost, and on the other hand also avoid a situation of missed revenues. So only if someone is able to have a higher forecasting accuracy can be put into a position to better actually steer how supply chain flows need to be run and steered. So forecast accuracy obviously depends on the ability and capability to recognize short-term changes in demand to be able to properly steer production planning, but also it means to having the ability to master a shorter cycle to insight and way of perception when it comes to demand to properly allocate stock to where it is needed in the network. This can mean the use of state-of-the-art technologies, meaning machine learning driven approaches and algorithms, but it may actually start with very basic capabilities and technology enablers which have been around for a long time already. No matter what the exact approach is, it will put a supply chain decision maker in a position to have more transparency on demand patterns driven by data analytics. A next block to talk about would be fulfillment and more specifically order management. And here I believe the key point observed in the COVID situation was those who were lucky enough, whose demand channels shifted from, let's say, brick and mortar shops to an online channel. The majority of these basically suffered this as well because they weren't ready to basically accommodate the volumes now coming in or shifting to an online channel. And the lack of ability to adapt and properly scale order management operations should never become a bottleneck, because that's just something a supply chain or a corporation can't afford. And that's what we kept saying to our clients for years, also in post-COVID time, pre-COVID times, and which proved to be right now and became a reality. So many of our clients who were, again, lucky enough that revenues didn't completely disappear, but shifted the channel, weren't really ready. And so a key recommendation is not to forget some of the basics or getting some of the basics right when it comes to properly operating the order management function. And this basically means to try and foster order management and fulfillment integration for transactional, but as well as customer interactive activities. It means driving up resilience through the use of intelligent automation opportunities and capabilities, driven by a first-time right approach, which will basically foster the idea or the attitude to drive a friction order management function. And it may also require to look into command center or control tower concepts to actually set up and put up the right focus of specific order management operations onto specific parts of the supply chain. Now, when it comes to fulfillment and delivery execution, Carolina, please share some of your insights that you got here.
Yeah, well, when we speak about delivery execution, I think it is important to keep in mind what are the processes and all the steps involved to get the products from the warehouse to their final destination. As I mentioned earlier, it is not just about the physical movement of goods, but we also have many transactions in terms of financial transactions and transactions, exchange of information. So if we think of the amount of documents, for instance, that are needed to get products from A to B, many of these documents are paper-based and have been in this format for a while, right? So the logistics industry is quite traditional, but that also means that there is a lack of efficiency when it comes to avoiding information replication and making sure that these exchanges happen on a very, very fast and efficient way. So I think that when it comes to delivery execution, what supply chain leaders need to think about is how do we manage our delivery execution operations in terms of making sure that these are as efficient as possible? How do we ensure that we don't have duplication of effort along the supply chain? And how do we measure KPIs? How do we measure success? And also, how do we ensure the transparency and visibility of operations, not only internally, but also towards the clients, right? So especially when it comes, let's say, to track and tracing capabilities. And I think that another aspect that it is very important to keep in mind is that different industries and different types of products have different needs, right? So it is not the same if we transport medical products or if we transport manufacturing goods. So I think it is very, very important to design your supply chain according to your business needs, according to your product portfolio, and according also to your customers' needs. And this also leads me back to the point of supply chain data. So as I mentioned, data is everywhere. And in supply chain, we like it or not, we cannot avoid the fact that data is coming back and forth. And in many situations, we have to deal with the challenge that there is not the proper governance, the proper structure, and the right processes in order to manage this data are not in place. So it is very important for companies to streamline their processes in order to make sure that they manage data in an accurate way, because making sure that the data is available at the right time and that the data is accurate is one very, very important efficiency driver, and also can ensure and reduce effort, right? Especially when we think about keeping a first time right mentality, having the right set of data in place and ensuring that the right level of effort related to manage this data is in place, which can be sometimes challenging in terms of dealing with legacy systems, for instance. But in this regards is where the adoption of technology, so Jörg has already just mentioned blockchain is just an example of this, but having the right technologies in place and adopting them at the right time, supported by the right business processes and the right infrastructure, is key in order to drive success when it comes to supply chain operations. And Jörg, do you have any further insights on this? So based on your experience, why is it so important to move towards digital supply chain operations and also kind of frictionless and touchless operations? How do we define this?
I mean, the reason for why it is so important, I believe, always goes back to supply chain resilience, and all of us experience what happens if supply chains are not resilient enough, right? So it is key, and I believe everyone would agree to that. Now, when it comes to how are we getting there, how are major global supply chains getting there, then I must say a key point to consider is that it's by far not only a technology play, right? But it's a significant business and digital transformation, and it can't go along without intelligent automation. However, again, an orchestrated or a conceptualized approach is required, simply because putting automation artifacts here and there just won't serve the purpose. No? Integration only comes with, along with, to some extent, centralization and consolidation, which are key enablers of integration as well. And considering all of these aspects then allow to improve or push up supply chain resilience. That means being in a position to at all observe, measure, track, and trace performance along a global supply chain ecosystem, obviously also fostering transparency and visibility, may require actually a new set of technologies, a new set of processes and governance in place, a new set of supply chain talent that need to be acquired, and all of this putting together at a central place, physically or virtually, but without centralizing and consolidating supply chain operations. I'm still having a hard time imagining how a leapfrog in terms of supply chain resilience may be possible. And we have stressed it, you and I, several times, that the journey may actually start with supply chain data. Getting that sorted and properly in order may actually be step one of many steps to come. Now, if we were to conclude, or if I were to conclude, I would say, let's rather embrace the evolution which happens out there in supply chains, rather than reactively enforcing a revolution at a point in time which may be too late and put oneself in a reactive only position. So I guess that's the majority of the points I wanted to make. So I'd like to ask you, Carolina, to conclude as well.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think we cannot stress this too much. It is not just about safeguarding supply chains now and getting back to business in the short term. It is about ensuring long-term resilience and asking ourselves as supply chain leaders, what will happen if a disruption of this kind comes again, right? Is our supply chain prepared? And for this, as we have already mentioned, it is not just about technology. Of course, it is not. Technology is just an enabler, but it is also about having the right setup and the right infrastructure when it comes to strategy, business processes, governance, and organizational culture behind to support your journey towards truly and real digital transformation.
All right. Yeah, I believe we've provided at least a rather complete set, a high-level complete set of our insights and things we observe out there in the market. So let me open up this conversation for questions, and I see there's a first question popping up in the chat. So please use that opportunity to send questions in the chat. And the first one is, how do you think the supplier landscape will evolve in the near future? So Carolina, what's your view on that?
Yeah, well, I think that in light of the current crisis, companies will for sure want to restore their operations. This will for sure imply to look for a new landscape in terms of suppliers, and there will be an impact on that. However, it is hard to predict what is coming next, right? And even prior to the coronavirus crisis, top companies across industries have already identified this area, and also together with some other supply chain areas have one of the key drivers to ensure business continuity and success. In light of the current crisis, many challenges have been faced, and the question is how do we react now, right? So I would like to answer this question with a 3 steps kind of approach. So as I mentioned, in the first step is about getting back to business, safeguarding your supply chains, making sure that you are able to continue business, ensure business continuity. And also this is related to how do you empower your suppliers and your supplier network. But the second aspect to it is how does your long-term strategy look like? How do you ensure business continuity in the long term? And also how do you minimize the risk of not only expected but also unexpected kind of situations when it comes to supply chain? So as I already mentioned, I think the third aspect to it is actually using and empowering your supply chain operations, making use of digital enablers and technology tools that enable you to gain a higher level of visibility along your end-to-end supply chain operations.
Thank you, Carolina. So looking at the participants, any other question coming up? So there's a next one. Which technology adoption, besides the blockchain, do you see as most crucial in the upcoming months?
So I can take that one.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so when we speak about building supply chain resilience, and I really want to stress on this, we are not just speaking about technology, right? So we are speaking about real business transformation. So for us, technology is an enabler, and it is a very important component of digital transformation, but it is not the only one. So as I see it, technologies such as blockchain, RPA, artificial intelligence are already playing a very, very important role. And we all know that technologies are evolving at a really fast pace. But as I have seen it, in many cases, technology is not the challenge. It is about having the right roadmap behind and the right process set up to support implementation, and to ensure that it is not just about implementing or spending money on a technology. It's about identifying the right situation, the right business case, the right use case, and making sure that these kind of implementations are successful in the long run.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? If not, that is okay. So then we want to thank you for your attention, for joining this webinar. If ever there's another question, please don't hesitate to approach either Carolina or myself. And well, then in closing, that's been Carolina and Jörg from Capgemini's Business Services Digital Supply Chain Practice. Talk to you soon, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.